So today let's talk about Catharism. Who were the Cathars? The Cathars is a term that means pure. I believe from Greek, katharos should mean pure. It's, by the way, the etymology of names such as Catherine, although I think it's still debated because the etymologies are not really clear at this point in history. Because they might really derive from the ancient tongues, but they could be used or had different usage and meaning in particular context. However, the one of Cathars is a term that basically emerges from clerical and ecclesiastical culture. That used it, especially since the 12th until the 14th century, to define those who instead called themselves either good Christians or just Christians, or in Latin boni homines, which means good people, and who interpreted and lived Christianism in a dualistic interpretation, broadly counterposing spiritual reality of the God of good and a material reality of the God of evil. Why are Cathars important in low medieval history? Well, were mostly important for a crusade that was launched against them at the beginning of the 13th century, that however had roots even in the century before that, because the Catholic Church had already spotted this heresy substantially early on. By the way, in a moment in European history in which, religiously speaking, there were lots of such movements that had a quite heterodox, if not heretical connotation. And they were not famous just for the Crusade. Let's say that the Crusade that was launched against them and that brought to their annihilation is most famously remembered as one of the cruelest wars that has ever been fought during the Middle Ages, because there were a lot of massacres of civilians that were in fact accused of being heretic. But this is a story we won't be discussing today. What is important, according to me, of Catharism, although I'm not really an expert about it, is really the, as I was saying before, the religious context in which from which it emerged, and broadly speaking, even its roots and its causes, because it was a very complex movement. First of all, there was a debate in historiography to define what Catharism had really been, because as we have seen when discussing at the beginning of the video the the definition of Cathars and hence of Catharism, we remembered that it was a name that wasn't really the one that the Cathars used, and together with it, let's say that most of what we know about the Cathars is in fact what the Catholics, and more in general the Catholic Church, basically left written, recorded about them, by the way, as the winners who had exterminated them. Which is interesting because obviously through the Church of Rome's eyes you can read even the aims and the ideological constructions that the popes at the time were making, the great power they had in moving actually the Kingdom of France and other powers against the Cathars, who were also called the Albigensians, because they had their center in the Occitan city of Albi in southern France. But indeed, there has been a lot of debate, historiographically speaking, to really assess who these Cathars were, in order to even better understand what these people believed themselves to be. And I repeat, I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, the tendency, the historiographical tendency today, is really to, in a certain sense, deny the great part of the heretical nature of the heretical nature proper of this movement, because really the Albigensian Crusade, or the Cathar Crusade, was really intertwined with a lot of other political problems at the time. There was, first of all, at the time, you have to think the Church of Rome was at the peak of its power. It had a huge influence all over Europe, and sovereigns were really eager to win the papal favor in order to do, to obtain certain things in return. And the Albigensian Crusade was really fought very cleverly, by the way, by the King of France, Philip II, who sent there a lot of French noblemen to get them really out of the way, because they were pretty influent and arrogant, and they threatened the French king with their power. And he sent them in southern France to win this part of Languedoc, while he, with mercenaries, who were much more faithful than his French noblemen, was leading very in person and very efficiently his campaigns against the English kings, who had their fief on the French soil. At the same time, were interests that, in this sense, made the French kingdom expanding a lot, and in southern France, and this entailed a clash between the Capetian dynasty, the French Capetian dynasty, with Aragon. Aragon, who at the time had interests and even parental bonds with the nobility in southwestern France, where the Crusade was fought. There were a lot of other interests all around, and issues of even of commercial, obviously, reasons, and that are very complex to scope. But what we really want to point out here is that it's not really said that these Cathars were like the heretics, with an heretic solid identity that believed firmly against the Church of Rome. It seems that most of them didn't even consider themselves as heretics, or that they according to them, were simply following their interpretation of the Bible in a more or less orthodox way. And therefore, this identity of the heretics was really fabricated by the Church of Rome and the King of France, in order to to legitimate and to justify this war of invasion against the the county of Toulouse, which was, by the way, one of the major powers in southern France, and that obviously was eventually it was very prized by the French, and was eventually inherited, by the way, after the Crusade through a marriage, because initially the French basically conquered with Simon de Montfort, who was one of the greatest generals at the time. It's famous for the Battle of Muret, and broadly speaking for defeating these the county of Toulouse and seizing all its lands. But when he died, hit by a mangonel, a rock thrown by the mangonel, I don't know why you laugh, but I always found it pretty unlucky death. At a siege during the end of the war, basically the county of Toulouse retook everything, and the way the French eventually inherited it with Louis IX, would have been Louis IX at the time. I think he was still a prince, a French, not French king. Eventually passed in the Capetian hands, and it's famous eventually this that eventually you find this moment of grandeur of the French kingdom that had managed to unify the whole France, at least at that moment, and began to launch a lot of offensives through the Mediterranean in order to expand this power. It is a great story. We will talk about that someday, I hope. But going back to the Cathars, and therefore trying to describe them, trying to, you know, to really define who they were, I think it's interesting to explain a bit the organization and the concrete identity of them, for as much as we can know about it. First of all, the Cathar movement was a weak one. I mean, it was strong in terms of cultural rooting and, probably even a genuine feeling and an aspiration, religiously speaking, in terms of religious sensibility, but it was a movement that, as such, as a group of men, as a society, didn't reach absolutely not even a doctrinal or an organizational unity. The reason being that it was really torn apart by internal contrasts, and obviously it was also heavily persecuted, so it had prosecuted, that's the term, but it's more legal, but generally speaking it gives you the idea of how this movement was eventually treated. So it couldn't reach a real solid integrity or a real scope. However, and this probably was one of the most problematic points, is that it proposed itself in open competition with the Roman Catholicism as a structured religion, which was a good move instead in this on its side, because it wanted to pose itself as a point of reference, a new and consistent point of reference in front of those social groups and political forces that it aimed to win, spiritually speaking. And this, as we said, had its greatest impact in Languedoc, in southern France, in today's southern France. At the time it wasn't even considered as France. France was just the northern part of today's France. And it's interesting because, especially today, relatively to this, because many historians have attached to this movement a sort of national character of the Occitan country towards the rest of of, um, of Europe, in that sense, relatively to France, because those were regions that were theoretically part of the Kingdom of France, and you can find similar episodes in other regions, such as Burgundy, Flanders, the Rhineland, and center and northern Italy, that were entities that really made sort of a national identity on its own. And you have to think of the Europe at that time as a sort of mosaic of various, let's say, regional sized, I can't say nations, but countries that had a sort of common identity, and that often followed also a particular spiritual sensibility. And these regions that I named, if you notice, we said Burgundy, Flanders, the Rhineland, and central northern Italy were at that time not seat of a kingdom. They didn't have it because theoretically probably Burgundy still had something that had to, I don't know how to say it in English, but let's say that theoretically it should have had a king. I think still at that time it wasn't really anything like that. Burgundy was an aborted kingdom in the Low Middle Ages. Flanders equally, they had their own identity. The Rhineland also, and all its cities, very industrious cities, really did have their own identity. And central and northern Italy were indeed also very rich cities, independent from any king, essentially. So there were all areas of frontier. And it's very meaningful because what you find is that phenomenon like these heresies didn't take place in the Kingdom of France proper, or in the Kingdom of England, or in the Kingdom of Sicily. I mean, places where there was, politically speaking, a strong unity, and even the possibility of spreading a common faith. In this sense, obviously the Catholic orthodoxy, but let's say where there was a happy, more or less at least, union or bond with the national church. Even though there weren't really national churches, but already at that time, it was felt to be part of a kingdom, even by the local clergy. And it's very interesting because in Languedoc, as well as in these other regions that also had heresies on their own, although not really Catharism, but something similar that approached it very closely. These new ideas really spread with at every level, we can say, both in the leading class, the ruling class, but also in classes that were active in the cities and in the country. So these were phenomena that deeply upset the Church of Rome and all those political entities that were in fact loyal to it. So we're talking about other great movements that we can define as the Pauperistic-Evangelic movements. Well, the Cathars were part of them. And there is probably more to it. I'm undecided whether to talk about it now or at the end. Probably at the end it's better. For now, let's say that the important thing is that Catharism presented itself as an alternative system to the Roman Catholic one. In order to satisfy comprehensively the religious ambitions and the existential anxieties, whether they were individual or collective. So they were movements and inspiration that really had a very broad a very broad reach and a capacity of insert itself in those process of definitions of an identity that that was cultural and deeply cultural and adopted by political and social forces that were quite autonomous on their own, as we have seen, and that were trying possibly even to politically get away from the framing that hegemonic ecclesiastical apparatus of the Church of Rome was trying to put its ends on themselves. And therefore there was immediately an antagonism by Catharism that couldn't be tolerated by the Church of Rome. And at the same time, these brought unavoidably to an imitation, a Cathar imitation of the same Church of Rome, which is a bit of a paradox because the Cathars were really against, what the Church of Rome represented as a sort of as a earthly power and as a quite rich and politically strong mundane entity as they preached. Instead, something completely different, dedicated to poverty and so on. But as it often happens, you also learn from your enemies, and especially in order to give such a broad political, to give a success to such a broad political aim, there had to be some form of organization of this movement that was motivated from the Church of Rome. And this was obvious also because, Languedoc was a fully Christian place at the time, at least for the standards of the time, and therefore the world churches were priests. The Cathars really played in a parallel way, but at this point, as we've seen, they had spread everywhere, so they could build eventually a really let's say a ecclesiastical structure on its own that really resembled the Catholic one, and therefore we can say that Catharism was a sort of great putting together of many factors, ambitions of political autonomy from the Church of Rome, a real religious tension and sensibility, and attraction for a pure way of life, far away of the earthly aspects that the dualistic interpretation considered as evil, really, but at the same time it tended to emulate the Catholic Church for how it had developed. Now I would like to add two further considerations of Catharism from this point of view that probably I will repeat in some other video when we will be talking about eventually how the whole Cathar stuff really developed from with the clash of Rome and all the story that is actually pretty dramatic one. This video was mainly to describe Catharism as a very complex thing, not really as one movement that you could easily identify and say, yeah, those were Cathars, because this is what really the Church of Rome eventually did to it. In order to say those were the bad guys and we got rid of them, we give them a strong characterization that cannot be equivocal. Reality was instead another matter. Reality was, for what we know historically speaking, much more complex, much more even difficult to define, to bring together in this sense as a unitary movement. The first thing I would like to say is that I've read many interpretations about what the Cathars, why the Cathars were there, first of all. I repeat for the third time in this video, I'm no expert really on what the situation really was, but and there is one interesting point, that this Catharism really emerged from something which had real deep roots. There is an hypothesis that has been done, which I believe it's very broadly accepted at this point, which is interesting because it compares the religious developments, and not only of Western and Eastern Europe, because it seems that Catharism might have had really a lot to do with Bogomilism. Bogomilism was a dualistic heresy that was extremely close to Catharism, as much as we know, that was widespread in the Byzantine Empire, really before the Cathars in southern France. Really, it had deep roots, even very ancient ones, and it was, by the way, such a fierce. It was so fiercely resistant to Byzantine Empire that basically it was the only it required the only the only crusade that the Byzantines really ever fought, because the Byzantines were really astonished of what the Crusades were in the West, like a pope sending political powers fighting. It was absurd. The Byzantines had a wholly different spiritual sensibility, or at least theoretically they had different rules. It was just the emperor who sent to fight and against the enemies of the empire, and the Bogomils were the only guys who really made the Byzantine gears grinding at the point of needing them to send a crusade in order to exterminate them. It's very interesting because at this point, this was done during the Komnenian dynasty, so in the 11th and 12th centuries, and it's very interesting because many historians actually said that parts of the refugees that eventually fled from the Byzantine Empire went to southern France through the Mediterranean, and basically brought there these beliefs. Other historians say this is not true. I mean, yeah, they even theoretically can accept that there were contacts indeed, but they said that basically what happened with the Cathars was a wholly Western European affair, that it was born in Aquitaine, in Languedoc, because of peculiar traits of those regions' cultures, and it doesn't have much to do with them. I personally think that both factors played a part, because it was such a big thing that you can't cut so sharply, the two things in two and excluding one of the two. The only problem is that we, as I said before, we don't know so much about the Cathars in the sense to really understand the deep roots in their own community, in their own religion. Obviously, the dualistic heresy was pretty much there, as much as we know, at least in certain contexts in the Cathar movement. It's possible that even the larger part, however, of their movement wasn't much doctrinally and theologically interested in defining such a sharp difference with Roman Catholicism, and what they were really doing was to have a different lifestyle that emphasized poverty as a value. I mean, material poverty, because really this dualistic heresy told you that all matter was evil. So even your own body, and the great heresy of this was basically that they denied that Christ had a human body, because it would have been to say from their own perspective that Christ was had a human nature that had been made up of evil. So they even denied that he died on a cross, because also the cross was made of matter and therefore made by the devil. And so you understand why it was fiercely fought both by Constantinople and by Rome as an heresy. But once again, as we already said, the Cathars probably didn't all push themselves so far in this sense. And the second point I would like to make in this direction is to think about the cultural context of Occitan. Probably many of medieval history lovers, especially girls, are fascinated and like the figure of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was one of the most amazing female individuals in medieval history. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, even mother to the famous Leonard, Richard the First of England. She was a great woman, and the story wants this, that she first before marrying with the French king, the English king to whom she bore Richard, and not only Richard, she had married, as a matter of fact, the French king, to whom instead had not born any son. The French king was famously Louis the Seventh of France, and relatively to the relationship between these southern French Duchess of Aquitaine and the French court, there was a great cultural difference, because the French court was very, very stern. They had a very deep, serious, moral, religious system. They they were quite rigorous. Louis VII was a very pious man. Southern France did, let's say better, Languedoc was instead conceived, and also here through the lens of the French. We know that at the time, like a completely different place, a Mediterranean country, with a lot of beautiful hot women who thought only about, you know, having fun and stuff like that. So everything that very stereotypical indeed, that probably doesn't reflect completely reality, but indeed there was a difference in this direction. And the lust for life that the southern France at the time displayed was typical of the chivalric ideals of sacred love that wasn't that sacred in practice, because it seems that in that sense they were quite libertine, in the bad sense of the word, and especially they were extremely rich lands. The local nobility, which was very different from the French one, because the French one had probably the richest nobility of all, but there were less people. There were less people with greater holdings. The southern French nobility instead were less people but more scattered, and overall they displayed, however, considerable wealth, but at the same time they were freer. There wasn't a central authority there except these major princes that towered from their wealth and military power, the most powerful of which was the Count of Toulouse. But Paris was very far. The French, until the Albigensian Crusade, didn't manage to control at all southern France, since the time of Clovis, even since the early Frankish times in Gaul, and therefore they had developed a much more, a much freer moral system, a much more liberal, let's say, moral system, and that emphasized wealth and knights and tournament and beautiful women and stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe it's a silly thing, but there have been people who have tried even to psychoanalyze the reason for Catharism in this context, and it emerged that probably these Occitans were very good Christians at the time, that they had nothing to by the way, there were areas of ancient Christianization. Christianity was there long before it was in northern France, or that at least it was widely spread. But in this sense, there was a contrast between the courtly life of love and of knights and this, great hymn to life and exaltation of earthly pleasures with Christianism. So people said that Catharism was something that spread in order to counterbalance this lust for pleasure, and that it really had such a deep and anti-materialistic connotation, exactly because of the wealth and in fact the material abundance that was present at these courts in southern France. And it's very fascinating also because this movement spread among aristocracy. We know of extremely wealthy noble women who basically threw away everything they had, and then they began to found monasteries and to preach and to participate in these Cathar movement actively. So I think that I think it's interesting as an interpretation because not much because of the Cathars themselves finally, but always to let us remember how deeply important it was in the Middle Ages to feel these spiritual tensions within one's soul, which is something that today we can't properly understand, because at the time it was really all about it. It really was about religion and God and the judgment. Think only about how more easily people died, and how in this sense sufferance and a continuous relating with death and human fate and spiritual problems was impellent. So I think in the Cathar movement you can find that too, indeed. For now I think I've said everything. There would be a lot to talk about: the clash with Rome and the Crusade, and a lot of other things, and also related to other movements such as the Poors of Lyon, and therefore the Waldensians, and there is much to say also relatively to the mendicant orders, to whom I have dedicated already 2 videos, and there is part of partly a reference to the Cathars in those videos. Go give a look to them. I think it's interesting. So I think step by step we're getting to these Middle Ages. As always, if you like this video, please feel free to subscribe to my channel. If you share this video, please do it as much as you can, because it's very important for me to get views and to make this channel grow. And obviously, as always, leave a comment if you want, or write me if you have a question. I can make a video response to it, in order, or just to give me an inspiration to what I could talk about in the future. And it doesn't have to be strictly about medieval history. You can ask everything. I mean, let's try to create a community. Let's try to create a contact between us. It's the best way to enrich us all with new interesting insights, and to have also fun together. I thank you for listening, and I wish you a nice day or night, wherever you are. See you next time.